Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture by Dr. Yiwen Shen, entitled Conversations Between the Western and Chinese Instruments and Selected Works. My name is Robert Martin. I'm the former director of the Bard College Conservatory of Music, and it's my great pleasure to serve as moderator. Our project, Ink Art and New Music, involves 7 composers, an ensemble of players, and an art historian. The 7 composers include 2 undergraduate students from Bard, 2 PhD students from the University of Hong Kong, and 3 professional composers. The ensemble consists of students from the Bard Conservatory, some who play Chinese instruments and some who play Western instruments. And the art historian is Dr. Leslie Ma, curator of ink art at Museum Plus in Hong Kong. The project, Ink Art and New Music, has 3 phases. Phase 1 consists of 4 lectures. The first, that familiarized us with Chinese ink art as a source of musical inspiration, and the remaining 3 on compositional techniques building on that inspiration and scored for combinations of Chinese and Western instruments. The first lecture was given by Leslie Ma, the second by Yunping Chen, the third by Hingyan Chan, and the fourth today by Yiwen Shen. Phase 2 of the project takes place next April in 2022, in person finally, at Bard in New York's Hudson River Valley, when the annual symposium of Bard's US-China Music Institute is given over to our topic, Chinese ink art and new music. By then, the 7 composers will have written new works for the Bard Conservatory Ensemble. The 4 student composers will have been mentored by our faculty composers, who themselves will have written works for the Bard Ensemble. Phase 3 consists of public performances of the 7 new works, first at Bard and Annandale-on-Hudson, New York, and then in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong. This is an exciting and rather unique project involving collaboration between the faculty and students, cultural exchange between East and West, and cross-fertilization between the visual arts and music, all based on cooperation among 3 different institutions, Hong Kong University, Museum M+, and the Bard Conservatory, and all made possible because of the hard work of the project's principal organizer, Yunping Chen, and the administrative and technical expertise of Sharon Liu and her colleagues at Hong Kong University's music department. Now I would like to introduce the student composers. Olga is a composer and sculptor, born in Beijing, China, living now in Tivoli, New York, and a 3rd-year student in the Bard Conservatory and Bard College, with a 2nd major in studio arts. So Olga, if you could wave so we know who you are. Wonderful. Austin Leung is a recent graduate of the Royal Academy of Music in London and now a PhD student in composition at Hong Kong University. Okay. Jing Wang received her bachelor's degree in Beijing, her master's at the Hochschule für Musik und Tanz in Cologne, Germany, and is now also a PhD student in composition at Hong Kong University. So Jing, if you could wave to us, good. Samuel Mutter is a composer, pianist, and trumpeter with a strong interest in film music, now in his 2nd year in composition at the Bard Conservatory. Thank you for joining us today. I'll turn to you for comments or questions at the conclusion of the lecture. Yiwen Shen, our speaker, is a conductor, composer, and pianist. He currently serves as the Assistant Dean of Performance Activities at the Tianjin Juilliard School. He made his conducting debut in China at the National Center for the Performing Arts in Beijing, and he has also worked with many orchestras in Europe and North America. Chen has received many composition commissions and awards. His full-length ballet, The Crane Calling, toured over 30 cities in China. It had its European debut in 2017 and North American debut in 2018. We at the Bard Conservatory are proud to count Chen as one of our first graduates. He received dual bachelor's degrees in composition and German studies at Bard. After that, he received his master's degree and doctorate in composition from Juilliard and a master's degree in orchestral conducting from the University of Maryland. So it is my great pleasure now to welcome Yiwen Chen.
Thank you, Bob, so much for the wonderful introduction. It gives me great honor and pleasure to give this talk on conversations between the Western and Chinese instruments in selected works. First of all, I would like to thank my alma mater, Bard College Conservatory of Music, the University of Hong Kong, and M+ Hong Kong for creating this project and inviting me to serve as one of the speakers and mentors, and Dr. Yangping Chen for curating and facilitating many wonderful conversations, as well as many staff behind the scenes to support this project. Also, thanks to Dr. Leslie Ma, Dr. Yangping Chen, and Dr. Hingyan Chen for the very informative and enlightening lectures during the past month. As Bob introduced, I studied piano and composition at Bard and the Juilliard, and also conducting in my studies, 13-year studying in the States. And now I'm coming back in China to teach at the Tianjin Juilliard School. So I often think, when I talk about writing for mixed ensemble for Western and a Chinese instrument, I think it's a very similar experience to when you go to a foreign country. One needs to speak to another in a language that they can understand each other, and also through gestures, through context, to communicate. And then finally, they can understand each other. So I was thinking about my days at Bard as an international student. It was through some good conversations with my foreign friends that to improve my English or to understand the English as a secondary language. Or sometimes people do not understand each other. That's also possible. Or then people start using more gestures, using more body language to help understand. So conversation is an interactive communication between two or more people. So it's a similar analogy for writing Western and Chinese instruments combined. I think it's very important that when writing for such mixed ensemble, we need to understand what kind of language those instruments speaks. I think for Western instruments, there are many, many good textbooks on instrumentation or orchestration. So you get to know those instruments through the books. And then there are many, many good literature and repertoire for those instruments for us to study. But I think the lack of a good textbooks on Chinese instruments, how they sound, or what are the playing techniques, is creating some of the issues for composers to write for Chinese instrument. I think it's very, very crucial to understand, first of all, what the instrument is good at, what the instrument is not good at. I think those are very, very crucial points to remember while you're composing for Chinese instrument. From my own experience, I had a chance to study guzheng while I was 7 years old. And I love the instrument, even though I didn't pursue the career in guzheng playing. But I think it had left a very good memory in my mind, and that helps a lot with my future composition for the Chinese instrument. And in the middle school in Shanghai, as a pianist, I helped with a lot of my friends with their repertoire, their traditional Chinese instrument repertoire. I played with my Erhu friend, I played with my Pipa friend, also I played with my Dizi friend. And also I made lots of friends, with, Chinese instrument and also Western. The reason is that I think it's important that when you write for the instruments, you have someone to consult with, because they will know the instruments way better than we do. We can ask them, what is the idiomatic writing for the instrument? What kind of repertoire should I listen to if you are writing a slow piece or if you are writing a faster piece? Ask for their opinion, their suggestion on the repertoire that you should listen for. And also, what are the techniques for a good virtuosi? There are lines that everyone can play, but there are very, very difficult passages that only a very good virtuosi player can play, can execute. So that when you are writing such passage and then you have a good player, if there's things that do not work well, it's not their fault, it's your fault. You can reflect on your own writing to think about, okay, maybe this is not working as you had predicted, because the instrument doesn't speak in that way. It doesn't speak such language in that way. And also, we often talking about extended technique. What are the extended technique? Or is the extended technique effective in some of the writings for this instrument? Or it's only just kind of an effect? And how do we use extended technique? How much do we use extended technique? I think this is also another big topic that, for me, I'm thinking about extended technique needs to serve some kind of purpose. There are many good idiomatic writing for those Chinese instruments without extended technique, and then they still sound very fresh, and they can sound very modern as well. So you need to use those extended technique with a understanding what kind of purpose it serves. And also you need to understand what is the restriction of this instrument, right? I think in Dr. Chen's lecture last week, we talked about there are many restrictions for Chinese instruments, but do not blame them. You take advantage of what those instruments are good at. Just like you are given a flute to write for, you wouldn't complain that the flute cannot do double stop, right? You would just write in a flute language. So there's not so much difference when you're writing for a bamboo flute, for example. So my talk will be divided into two parts. Part one, I will introduce some of the traditional and modern repertoire and some of my own writing for those individual instruments. It's a very pity that I have never written for a piece for the Western and Chinese instrument combined, but I had written many works for solo Chinese instruments because I felt it's the solo work that those instruments lack of. And then it's only through writing for a solo instrument that I really know what the instrument can do or what the instrument can do in its best. And part two, I will explore some of the works by other composers who did write for mixed ensemble, and I will discuss how they create such conversation in their works. Okay, so this is a page that discusses the standard repertoire. I only listed a few. The list can go on and on. Some are traditional Chinese works for Pipa. Some are written by contemporary composers like Chen Yi or Qing Wenchen. So when we talked about Pipa, I think Pipa is a very, very universal instrument. I think can have many different techniques and can do many different things. For the Pipa, the left hand is kind of the fingering for the notes, and then the right hand is the playing technique. Actually, Pipa are two words that to talk about the playing technique. P as outward playing, and then Pa is the inward playing. But there are also many other techniques for Pipa. For example, there's a tremolo technique called 轮指. It's basically you are producing a sustained sound to sustain a note. It sounds like a tremolo, right? But also there's a little different called a 摇指, meaning you are only using one finger to create a sustained sound. But the timbre from both those tremolos are very different, right? And also P and Pa is talking about a second finger and a first finger technique. But there are also different fingers you can use to pluck and pick those strings to create very different timbres. I think this is very important to remember. Even just you're wearing a fingernail, right? Even just pluck the finger inwardly versus outwardly, you produce a very different kind of timbre. I think this is very important to know. Those are the idiomatic writing for Pipa. And also, as we know, Pipa are it has 4 strings, usually tuned as la, re, mi, la. So you need to understand what kind of double stops are possible, or triple stops, or quadruple stops possibility. Okay, and also there are possibilities of creating counterpoint, because you have fingers to play on different strings at the same time to create a counterpoint. And then you need to understand, in order to write this counterpoint, what is the fingering that you have to use on the left hand. Say, I'm holding one note, so I can still finger the other note, but it has to be within close position, etc. Right? Also, since it's a string instrument, so there are possibilities about the harmonics. What are the natural harmonics? What are the artificial harmonics? What are the possibilities, and what kind of timbre it is to produce those harmonics? I think it's very important to understand what kind of language the Pipa speak first. And then if you don't know the language, you ask your friend. Have a Pipa friend demonstrate. Sit there and watch them playing the Pipa for hours. And then you will gradually starting to understand the language of Pipa, to get into the Pipa world. This is a piece that I wrote back in 2004 while I was still a student at the music middle school in Shanghai. It got an inspiration from the Terra-cotta warrior. The Terra-cotta warrior in Xi'an is kind of a state of art. There are, depicting different people and depicting different horses, or letting you to the imagination of those battle scenes from the ancient time. So every single man is similar but different. So it's a perfect usage of those Pipa technique to illustrate those similar in form but different timbre in sound. So we'll hear an excerpt from the work. So every single technique in this past passage were not created by me, even those extended techniques. Those can be found in the traditional repertoire. So it's just how you create them, how you utilize them, and for which purpose. I think I was trying to depict those battle scenes and to use some of the percussive sound and to imitate what kind of a battle scene to create such an image. Okay, and then you can definitely hear, those plucks with different fingers, inwardly, outwardly creates such a different kind of timbre in this work. I think this is one of the very intriguing thing about writing for Pipa. And also, as Dr. Chen said last week, knowing those open strings, what are the open string possibilities and the double stops that you can create with those open strings is also very beneficial for your writing for the instrument. Okay, I think for writing for Pipa, it has lots of technique, but it also gives you lots of possibilities. Okay, next we talk about bamboo flute. Again, I listed some works, traditional and some by contemporary composers like Tan Dun, Yang Qing, or Guo Wenjing, who had written for 2 bamboo flute concertos. Very, very wonderful. It pushes the limit of the instrument. So for the bamboo flute, it does come with a lot of restriction. First of all, it's a single line instrument. Second, for many of the traditional music, you will find that it doesn't really produce so much chromatic scales, or it's very hard to produce chromatic scales. But now I think with modern players, with their discovery and then their playing technique, chromatic scale becomes less an issue. But you still have to think it's a single line instrument. So you will have to write in a way that can be expressive for such instrument to sustain. So I wrote a work for solo bamboo flute back in 2006, right before I moved to the States. This piece is called Tracing Back, and it was inspired by a line from the book of poetry called 溯回从之, 溯游从之, meaning that going against the stream, or symbolically it can be understood as recalling or going back to the origin. So I'm trying to explore the possibility that for the bamboo flute, I start always from the lowest pitch, and then I grow from there. It's like, you have on a string instrument, you have the open string, but for the bamboo flute, there's the lowest pitch that carry the most weight. And then how a player can vary their sound quality just by changing the angle of how they blow into the instrument. Or there are some also extended technique I was trying to embed it into this work as well. So here's a quick excerpt. I think for a bamboo flute, it's very interesting to see the player, how they control the use of their ear to produce very weak but sustaining sound. Or sometimes it can have a very, very strong climax with just a one single note. I think it's very exciting to see how they are able to use and manipulate how they use their technique to create such effect. Okay, quickly go to the Erhu, traditional works, and also some of the modern work, even those modern works are not so modern nowadays. They're already a couple of decades old. The restriction of Erhu is very similar to the one with bamboo flute. It's a single line instrument, right? Even though you have two strings, but you are not able to play double stops. For the string instrument, you can play double stop, but for Erhu, the bow is in between two strings. So you either play the inner string or you play the outer string. So that's restriction number one. Restriction number two, it has a very, very limited range. The speaking part is only about 2 octaves. And then anything above the 2 octave gets, because the fingering gets very, very narrowed. So it takes a very, very good virtuosic player to execute that right. But what is the idiomatic writing for Erhu? I think, this existing every single Erhu piece, also Dr. Chen mentioned last week, is the portamento technique. How you use that to serve your own purpose, to write in your own language, in your own style. I think it's a very also interesting, very personal way to do that. And I wrote a work for Erhu solo back in 2007. Also, the inspiration came from the book of poetry. Is a line saying 窈窕淑女，君子好逑. It's basically saying cooing and wooing. And what I'm trying to experiment in this piece is how we can expand the tessitura of an Erhu. If it's going into a higher register, what kind of character it can bring in. And also the use of portamento or slides is also a very interesting topic that I was trying to experiment this piece with. This excerpt will start from the midway from page 1. Okay, here's an excerpt from the Erhu piece. I think I was trying to see, what are the characters from those different registers, and when it's mixed together to create such melody and to have a very expanded textura for Erhu melody to play within. Okay, and then lastly, to talk about guzheng, it's also a very good instrument, the instrument that I studied, but I waited until very late to write for. Some of the traditional repertoire and also a contemporary work by Ye Xiaogang and a contemporary work by Wang Zhongshan. Guzheng is also, one of the instruments that I felt has much fewer restriction than the bamboo flute or say the Erhu, because it has the possibility to create harmony. There are 21 strings. So it has a lower register, it has a higher register. So it's like the piano in the Chinese traditional instrument. But the restriction of guzheng comes from the tuning of those strings. So you have 21 strings, and basically those are all open strings, right? And once this tuning is set for a piece, it's very, very hard to reset that tuning. And because when you reset, you will have to move some of the on the guzheng, you have to move the mazi on the guzheng to adjust the tuning, and then you create a very awkwardness in your piece, unless that's part of the effect you want to bring into that piece. But that's an issue, that's a restriction for guzheng, because every note that you are now tuned with will be considered as an open string, right? And then your left hand and your right hand can play those open string, but basically you only get 21 notes to work with. And it's not a quote-unquote chromatic instrument, right? Because unless you set some of the tones in chromatic, but you also have to expand from the lower register to higher register, because those mazi cannot be put too close together, especially towards the higher register. And you need the left hand and right hand coordination in order to write for guzheng, meaning that if it's an open string, you can plug with both hands. Okay? If this is some kind of note that is not part of your original setting of the tuning, then you have to use the left hand to bend the pitch in order for the right hand to plug with the right pitch. That meaning that you lost the left hand to do anything in terms of counterpoint. So again, you are back to your right hand. And then if you write a 3-note chord, all those 3 notes are not in your tuning, and it becomes not impossible, but very difficult to produce. With your left hand, you have to bend all 3 strings to produce such pitch. So it does need some kind of understanding of how to write for guzheng. And it's a great instrument. It has lots of potential and ability to create a very, very nice things. But you do have to understand this is part of the restrictions, the left hand and right hand coordination with the tuning. Okay, and then this is a piece that I wrote back in 2012 for a friend of mine, and the inspiration I think comes from Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. And I'm trying to base this piece on some of the basic harmonic and rhythmic ideas from Stravinsky's masterwork, not in any superficial imitation, but trying to shape it into Zheng's fashion. I think just quickly going through the score, this is how I wrote in terms of the pitches that are not in the open string. So I will write, for example, a half note and say this is F sharp, meaning that G is produced from the F sharp. Mainly to remind myself that, okay, so in this part, the left hand needs to bend the pitch of that F sharp in order to produce that G for two quarter notes for a half note value. And then the left hand has the time to plug those two notes, bong, dong. And then this F sharp needs to go a slide into that G, so that left hand is no longer available. I think similarly you see here, measure 124, that for that B flat and a C, both notes are produced from this A. So meaning that the left hand needs to bend this pitch for this entire quarter note. So this is a way, I think, while you're writing for guzheng, just to remind yourself, okay, here is the place my left hand won't be available because it needs to do something on the other side of the string in order to produce that pitch. Okay, here's a quick excerpt. Okay, so if you do get to write for guzheng, I would encourage you to spend a lot of time contemplating on what kind of open string you will set for the instrument. You know, those traditional the repertoire, they set the open string usually to a pentatonic scale. But if you do want to set it in a sculptural way, make sure that you think about it very carefully in terms of how you want to create a artificial scale on your own, because that's going to determine the basic tonality, especially when you have a counterpoint going on, like the right hand you are doing a tremolo and then the left hand has two pits. those pitches, and it can only be those open string, remember, right? Because the left hand can bend the pitches, but if the right hand is already doing something, you're creating a counterpoint, it can only play those open strings. So for me, writing for guzheng, the most difficult challenging is to create such tuning that will benefit your piece, your composition. Okay, so those four instruments are the most commonly used Chinese instruments. Of course, there are many other Chinese instruments. So if you do get to write for another Chinese instrument that are not in today's discussion, I think the learning process is a very similar one. You need to know the repertoire, you need to know the language, you need to know the grammar of the instrument in order to, and also make a good friend who plays such instrument in order to write for a very idiomatic way for the instrument. Now, let's come back to our today's topic and then go into part 2 to talk about the conversation between the Chinese and the Western instruments. I think, in terms of conversation, we first try, to imitate the other language, right? And then you are going into a conversation. There are ways of different, you're interacting with each other, or sometimes you're interjecting with each other, interrupting with each other. And then some gestures or some phrases can be interdictive or even disruptive. So those are the different ways that I tend to look into conversations. So of course, those will not summarize all those conversations happening in our daily life, but those are the ones that are very typical. And then I'm trying to look into the following works in terms of through those lenses. Not to say that the composer, when they wrote those pieces, they were thinking about those language or those usage of conversation, but I think it's a interesting way to look into those works. Here's a work by a good friend of mine, Li Lei, from Shanghai Conservatory, who got his doctorate there and now is teaching there. And this is called the Ode to Embroidery for Chinese Zheng and the Cello without bow. It was written in back in 2007. And it is to depict, the picture that I include here is not a picture. It's actually the embroidery from the Suzhou district or the Jiangsu province, in which you have countless dots to create this line, create this shape, and create many different layers. Okay, so in this piece, he is using cello without a bow, but only pits, right, to imitate the pick and pluck technique of the guzheng. So basically, the cello is trying to speak in guzheng's language to have a dialogue. Okay, here's an excerpt. Okay, I'll stop right there. I think you get the idea of this dialogue between the cello and the guzheng, and the cello is kind of speaking the guzheng's language, to create such conversation in this work. Okay, let's move on to the next example. This is a piece by another friend of mine, Chen, who got his doctorate from University of Chicago, and now he's a faculty member of the Central Conservatory. This piece is called Zheng, written for Chinese pipa and the double bass. And the inspiration of this music comes from the ceramic standing horse from the Tang Dynasty. And it is one of the most important artworks and cultural symbols of the historical Silk Road. Okay, and I picked this excerpt because I think it's very interesting, in which the composer is trying to use both the double bass and the pipa to imitate the sound of guqin. There's a very small instruction here. He says to mimic the Chinese guqin sound. It seems to me like a Chinese and American, they meet and then they suddenly start to speak in French. This is the feeling that I got. And then he had a very interesting tuning for the double bass. Instead of a traditional mi la re sol, he tuned every single string a major second above its traditional tuning. So it's fa sharp, si, mi, la. So every note that we see on this score will sound a minor seventh lower. And also in the dialogue that he's trying to create between the bass and the pits, it's as if they're one instrument. One is trying to finishing the other's thought. I think we also encounter such thing in our conversation is you start saying something and then the other person gets your idea and then commented on that. So here's the very interesting illustration of that from his music. Yeah, I personally really love this passage so much. It's kind of using those harmonics of both instruments. And then it sounds, just like guqin in such language. And then also the dialogue it creates between the two instruments. I think it's just amazing. The next work is by Nico Athens. He's also on faculty of the Tianjin Juilliard, who got his doctorate from the Cornell University. And this piece got its inspiration also from Shi Jing, the book of poetry. And I think it's very interesting that he is using a alto flute or piccolo, and then the percussion instrument, guzheng, and then cello, those four works, and then to create a sound world, especially at some of the passages where those instruments are doubling each other. And I think, the timbre it creates is just amazing. I think, while I was a student, one of the professors I had, or one of the master classes I attend, the professor said, you have a timbre and then plus a B timbre. that doesn't become a A-B timbre. That actually becomes a new timbre. It's a C timbre. I remember it to this day. So whenever you have instrument doubling each other, and you're inventing a new timbre on the spot. Okay, I think due to time strain, we'll not play this piece for you, but we'll be releasing this piece on the air very soon from the Tianjin Juilliard. So please watch out for that release. Okay. Let's move on to our next piece. It's by Tan Duan, who doesn't need any further introduction. It's a work for string quartet and a pipa, and it's remarkable for its seamless merging of the string quartet into the pipa's characteristic gestural language. Okay, so this is the first movement. After a introduction, a striking passage with a vivid gesture, the pipa and the three string instruments are serving as the accompaniment for the viola solo. So basically, again, the string instruments are imitating the pipa sound. Let's just hear a bit of it. Okay, so on and forth. I think especially for the first and second violin, it's kind of playing with the pipa register, and then it's just compensating each other with such rhythm, and then serve as a basic accompaniment for the viola. Okay, and then go to this is the second movement. It's the beginning of the second movement, kind of a scherzo. In which the percussive element, also on pipa and then three other instruments, dialogues with the elegant folk tunes melody. This time is on the second violin. It's a very simple concept, but it's just so effective to have this juxtaposition of a folk melody with those percussive sound from both the pipa and other string instrument. Okay, and then here's the climax of the second movement, in which it becomes even more percussive, and then people are even shouting out. All those players are shouting out. Here's the excerpt. Okay, I think you get the feeling of this part. So it was growing from the beginning melody until this point. Okay, here's a quick look of the third movement. It's both a touching adagio and a direct east-west synthesis. In this movement, there's a haunting quotation from Bach, and which is reworked in counterpoint with a song for pentatonic Chinese folk tune called 小白菜 Little Cabbage. Okay, and then these two elements are kind of speaking in two different languages, but in such a harmonious way. Okay, because of the time limit, let's just hear the second excerpt. This is on the second page from this double bar. Okay, and then the last piece I'm going to discuss is by Professor Guo Wenjing of the Central Conservatory. This is a piece written for Chinese gong and a solo percussion instrument, Chinese and Western orchestra. The piece is called Recitative for Chinese gong. Okay, and the excerpt I chose, it uses various extended playing techniques to bring the other instruments. It has the yangqing, the guzheng, all those Chinese other instruments, the bamboo flute, even cello and the double bass, all those instruments into the gong's sound world of indefinite pitch. And to me, it sounds like this is a newly invented language, like those ones that we don't understand, but in those movies that we watched. So it's a very interesting extended technique, but serving as a good purpose for this passage. So let's hear a quick excerpt. Okay, and then here is the last excerpt that is going towards the climax. And then in this part, every single instrument kind of comes into a rhythmic ostinato, and that drives the work into a climax. I think one can no longer differentiate whether this is a Western instrument playing or whether this is Chinese instrument playing. I think the language here becomes much less important, but the emotion, the drive towards that climax becomes more and more exciting. Here's a quick excerpt. Okay, I think you had a quick feeling of this piece. I think, the instruments, the language becomes much, much less important, but the climax is what he wanted to achieve over here. Okay. This will bring to the end of my talk, and thank you all for tuning in. And I really look forward to working with the students in the upcoming workshops on their compositions and then hearing their final products. Thank you very much.
Ewen, thank you so much. That was a wonderfully rich talk. I think you really made clear that there's not one kind of conversation. There's so many kinds of conversation, and very, very fascinating. So now it's a nice chance to have our students have some question. And how about Samuel? Any thoughts, questions, response? This is a good chance now.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Chen. This topic, this conversation, this presentation was just really wonderful, and I love the variety and diversity of the excerpts that you showed in terms of just the stylistic choices and the instrumentations. I thought it was like a really wonderful presentation. I guess maybe not so much a question, but more just a topic of discussion, perhaps, that I find just very interesting is this idea that we've kind of been talking about with all of these presentations, is the idea of, I guess, the word that has come across a lot, although today I noticed it wasn't in the presentation, and I kind of appreciated that, was this idea of reconciliation between these two kind of sonic and ethnic worlds of music. And it just, I've always found it interesting how in the previous presentations, the word reconciliation was used as if this was some sort of political or social conflict that needed to be dealt with. But I kind of prefer, I guess, the language that you use in your presentation, where it's less about political differences and more about taking the best of two different musical languages and putting them together. I really enjoy the linguistic sort of analogies that you use, and I just think it's very interesting how different people, I guess, have these different perspectives on what the two sonic worlds have to share and what they have kind of at odds with each other in a way. But I think the way you worded things in your presentation was very interesting, and I think there was sort of an ease with which you sort of, I guess, shall we say, reconcile these two worlds.
Thank you, Sammy, for making the observation. I think I'm also just trying to think a analogy in the so-called Western instruments, while writing for combined instrumentation. Of course, strings, we talk about when we write for a string quartet, the benefit in it has such a unique approach, unique sound. But, when we write for woodwind instruments or like a woodwind quintet, you get so much different character. There are two instruments with double reed and one instrument with single reed. And, for the flute, it's no longer even a wooden instrument. And then you don't even know what the horn is, why he is in, the horn player is, the horn is included in the woodwind quintet, right? You still have such different timbre from different family, but you don't feel that you need to reconcile either side, or trying to think, when you are writing an instrument with percussion, right? Of course, they speak in very different language, but I think we're all trying to find a way for those groups, those instruments to have a dialogue. Whether it's a dialogue or whether it works or not, it's a different story. Also, just coming back to the linguistic point of view, like if you put two persons together who do not speak any common language and try to let them communicate, I'm sure they will find a way to communicate, because otherwise, how did our our ancestors, from different part of the world, how did they eventually communicate and then find something as translation or start to learn each other's language? Because there has to be a way to start with that they can talk to each other, they can make each other understood. Of course, there might be misunderstanding, but there are ways to communicate, to have a dialogue. Maybe you say it in your way, I say it in my way. It's I'm imitating you, but in my own language, in my own style, in my own kind of sound world. So I think it's perfectly fine that we're trying to work out different possibilities. And also in composition, there's nothing right or wrong, so that you do have the freedom to explore such huge possibilities with those combination.
I'm going to turn now
Great,
to
thank you.
Austin. Yeah, good. Austin, do you want to have a
Yes.
question?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Chen. I have a question which is more like a practical question. So, as a conductor yourself, do you think in an ensemble with Chinese instruments and like Western instruments, do you think it's better to have a conductor, or maybe sometimes I let them like play by ear, etc.? Because in the Chinese culture, I mean the traditional culture don't have this sense of like looking at the conductor and following the beats, but in the Western, obviously, it's the conductor is the boss of the ensemble, right? So, do you have any thoughts about this?
I think, yeah, thank you for the question, Austin. I think also, just similar to you writing for Western instrumentation, that it really depends on the group of instruments that you're writing for. If you're writing for a duo, it will be very awkward to have a conductor. But if you're writing for many people, and then it will be feel natural, even just simply have a direction for people to follow. I think it's very natural. It also depends on the difficulty of the piece, whether you need a lot of coordination or whether it's more easier to follow. I think I'm glad you brought up this point, because I think while studying and conducting, I start to realize more and more how am I notating my work in my writing that will be easier for musicians to understand, easier to execute, but that reaches the same effect that I want to achieve. I think also, for some of the works that I showed, my own works, you see, I'm trying to write in a traditional notation that a player will understand to start with, so that you don't freak them out with a very modern look like, but it actually sounds very not that modern, or it sounds still like a traditional sound world, so that you start already making friends with your players right away, that they understand what you're writing. And also to a point that I think for many of the instances you will find with a traditional Chinese instrument, there is still kind of a notion of them, they want to do improvisation. You see in my Deeds piece, in my Erhu piece, they add a little grace note here, they add a little slide there, they add a little chopped note there. It's part of their language, it's part of their DNA to add such things. So I don't think limiting them will be a good idea either. So I think it's also just a good conversation with your friend while you're writing for this. You want to ask, do you want me to notate this down, or do you want me to give you enough freedom to present yourself? I think I had the bamboo flute piece transcribed for a flute, and I had it performed at a bar with a flute from the da capo players. And she mentioned, she said she listened to the bamboo flute recording. She said, there are so many things you're not really notating on a score, but I hear it in the recording. Can you notate it on a score? And then I explained to her, I said, that's part of the language for the bamboo flute, is they do those smaller improvisation. I think, coming back to your question regarding whether to have it conducted or not, I think it also depends on your work, the complex, and how you coordinate. I think in one of the pieces I showed by Lilei, it's with two instruments, and then there's no bar lines, right? You will imagine that the coordination will be very difficult, but there are ways that people can read each other's notation. I think the benefit now is basically all those players playing Chinese traditional instrument, they will read Western notations. So they can even read from the full score if you provide them, so they know where they need to line up with that instrument, or where this dialogue happened with other instruments. So definitely their coordination, but it's good to think about this while you're writing it. So basically you're achieving the same effect but with much simpler notation that people can follow, but you're getting still the effect that you want.
Good. I want to jump in actually with just a quick comment from the perspective of the chamber music player. We used to, almost a definition of chamber music might be 1/2 apart without conductor. And of course, it's tempting and sometimes necessary to have a conductor, but I just want to emphasize often something is even lost. It changes the mentality for the players, and I speak as a chamber music player. The kind of listening that one does when you don't have a conductor, somebody giving the beat, and you're interacting and watching each other in a different kind of way. So it's of course, it's a very interesting question, and but remember that there's something special. And I remember even in the early days when we learned to play complex works like Pierre Lunaire without conductor. And that, at one time that was a big thing. And now, of course, it's quite standard to play it without conductor. It changes the feeling in many ways. Okay, let's, I don't mean to interrupt or stop. Let's go on now. Let's see, Olga, do you have a comment or question?
Hi. Yes, I have something to ask you. Thank you, Shen Yuan, for the really informative lecture. And I like Sam, I like your analogy about considering, thinking music conversationally. And also, I grew up in China and came to the US when I was 16, and I have a similar experience with kind of like translation and kind of knowing another language. And I was thinking, just your analogy you brought up in the beginning of the lecture, you're talking about, it's like, you said how like composing for mixed ensembles, like coming to Bard and like learning, a second language and communication. And I was thinking, it's interesting, like, and how you were talking about, communication is possible even if there's no common language. Like, somehow we'll figure a way out, whether through gesture or through just like somehow by time. And I think that's a really it's a really moving thing to think about. But I was also thinking the other way around. It's like, I was just thinking about like sort of how communication is almost like pre-linguistic. It's like, it sounds like it's sort of linguistic thing when you think about communication, but it actually, it doesn't need language. And I was also thinking about how in your examples there, different composers using sound like to create new timbres. And I'm thinking how just by juxtaposition of sounds, like by making new sounds, like, sounds doesn't need to be communicated, or in other ways, I'm just thinking about, when you're thinking about communication, are you also thinking about like just sound, because I think sound doesn't really communicate anything when you just treat it as sound. But when you're trying to kind of make it into a syntactic structure, it gives. But for your own work, do you also kind of consider that kind of communication, or just like sound to be sound as opposed to like kind of language?
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Olga, for a very philosophical question, and I'll try my best to express my viewpoint, not maybe anything that worth bringing, but I think for me, just of course, sound is a sound, but how does this sound connect to the next one, or how does this sound produced by this instrument or this person gets reflected from another person, gets reacted from another person. That is the communication. Of course, when you're making your own sound, that's not a communication. Or sometimes it could be. I'm thinking about some solo Bach works, solo cello work. He has this single line, but within itself, it even had conversation by itself because of a different register, right? It started creating a dialogue among itself. Those are all single pitched sound, but because of the register, it creates a counterpoint even with a single line instrument. And then by counterpoint, you're talking about there is a conversation between the two lines, right? Or even three lines, if you look into that way. So I think, for a conversation, we talk about conversation involves at least the two people, but it can also be a conversation within yourself. You have two sides that are discussing with each other or arguing with each other. So I want to do this, or I want to do that. Like in a Schumann, I forgot what are the characters, but there are always those two kind of characters inside of his mind that are talking differently. This is also part of the conversation that one can have with one's own. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm just trying to sharing something from my perspective.
Yeah, can I follow up with something? I like what you said, but I'm just curious in your mind. So if, say, let's keep the metaphor going. If someone speaks English who doesn't understand like Chinese, and if someone speaks Chinese and they just have no mutual language. I mean, I have this experience. I love listening to other people talking in a language I have no idea, and I just like listen to the language as if it's like music, but like in that situation, I wonder, do you consider that a form of communication, like just two people talking to each other, but without understanding of what they're saying, but then they just kind of go back and forth on it. I'm wondering if that's in that kind of form of like, going back and forth, to consider that conversation, like, and I don't know, it's a little off topic, but I'm just really curious because you brought up this really kind of really enlightening metaphor that really made me think a lot.
Yeah, thank you. I think, when language becomes a barrier for communicating, right? And then you start to add some kind of a gesture, a body language, right? You're trying to find some common thing that, like nodding head means yes in most of the culture, right? Or thumbs up means good, in most of the culture, like this is okay, nodding head, and then you're trying to, and then you start to understand, okay, so this person in English is saying okay, or d'accord, oui means okay, that is probably yes in that language, and then you start trying to make your educational guess. And also I think it's just very interesting about language is you hear, say, French people talk for a long time, and then you go listen to Debussy and Ravel. You start to understand why their music is written in such way, right? And then we often say Chinese is such tuneful language, and then you start to listen to Chinese people compose, and then you start to understand why things gets very melodic for many instances. So you start to make those connections between those linguistic observations and in those observations of those compositions. I think while I was studying at Bard, I had the privilege to study German and also French. And then you start to understand the music more. Why German music is written in a such systematic and a very organic and a very kind of even grammatic way as it is. Because of the language, it has so many interesting cases and so many interesting grammars that it has. So I'm just also again trying to make some observations based on your point. Thank you.
Zheng, you're the last but not least of our students. Please, if you have a question or a comment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shen. I enjoy your pieces and also your lecture. Well, my question was kind of related to Austin's question, but I think you already answered a little bit. It's about changing meters and changing rhythms in the pieces. So I was wondering, as a conductor, how do you what do you think of this kind of phenomenon, and would you mind like sharing some experience of it, or do you have any suggestions about it for young composers and especially for the mixed ensemble?
Yes, I think thank you for the question. I think it's for me, now I also have knows the other kind of side of the coin, as a conductor. I'll speak from that perspective. I think the larger the group you have, trying to write even a more friend way in terms of your changing meter or many of the things that you can be notated in a simplified way. But don't get me wrong, I think still the effect, what you want, is the most important thing. And then try to notate in a way that still brings out that effect, but in a more user-friendly way. I think, I remember what Chen Qigang was saying. You can write a same piece not in all 16 notes. You can write everything in eighth note and quarter notes, but you just change the tempo, right? Instead of eighth note equal 80 something, you write a quarter note or half note equal 80 something, and it still has the same speed, has the same tempo, but notation wise it looks so much simpler. You look everything as eighth note and a quarter note. I think he was saying the smallest note value should be eighth note, so that you don't need to read those beams. Those are 3 or 4 beams, right? But same thing, it's the same effect. You don't lose anything from making it a simplified version in your notation. I think, this comes from while I was studying the piano. Those second movement from Mozart or from Haydn or even from Beethoven, those are so difficult with the rhythm, just because everything is the basic is you read the 16th note, you read the 32nd, and then read the 64th, right? But you can have doubled every note value by half or by 4 times, and then you still do the same tempo, and then everything will come out as the same. So I would say, the larger group you have, the more you need to think about how to simplify some of the writing, so that when it's put together, even without a conductor, there are things they can do. I mean, not necessarily, you have to change a meter. What if I do an accent here to bring out this irregular rhythm? Or do I have to change a meter here? And those pieces that I write for the Zheng, Chinese Guzheng, it changes meter every single measure because I'm writing for a solo instrument, right? Versus if, I'm writing for a group of 50, 60 people. I mean, a good orchestra will have no problem executing the Rite of Spring, but it will also take very, very much time, for them to put together, especially if you don't have the treasure to have a top, group to play for you. So I think, back to my point, first of all, you still think about what kind of effect you want to achieve. I don't want to compromise the effect that you want to achieve by saying, okay, just writing simple notation, don't worry about that. But you start from your effect. And then from effect, you start to think, is there better ways for me to notate this? Or, oftentimes I think for modern composition, we run into the trap that because, we have the engraving software that can have a direct feedback for us. Then we start to lose the playability of the section, with that many instruments, with that many people to play, to execute it in a way that you want. So I think, just to speak from another viewpoint to talk about this ensembleship.
Great. So Yiwen, I would like to take a moment to pass along a question from a member of our audience. In fact, distinguished member Tsai Jindong had a 2-part question. Perhaps you would have some answer. He asks if there are good reference books in English on Chinese instrumentation and orchestration. You mentioned that that it's difficult, but perhaps you have a suggestion. And the second would be good sources for finding the scores of some of the pieces, such as the ones you mentioned in your lecture. I suppose both the traditional and the contemporary. Any thoughts there?
Thank you, Bob, for the question, and also thank you, Jingdong, for raising this question. I think I haven't done so much research on the Chinese instrumentation orchestration book in English. The one I used while I was writing for those instruments was a textbook in Chinese, and it was written in 1980s. So I'm not sure if there are new ones and better ones. So I think that's also one of the difficulties for writing Chinese instrument is, you don't have a good reliable resource. Unlike, when you're writing for orchestration, this is the book and you go to, or there are, but I think, for a quick start, I think there are lots of, information online nowadays. But also I think one of the points I want to make from the lecture is you won't be learning more enough if you have a good friend that you're writing for, saying, for your upcoming project that you're going to write for Erhu, talk to that player that you're writing for, or talk to a Erhu player on your campus. Try to explore possibilities or those repertoires that the Erhu has, because those compositions or those players, they have explored many possibilities that beyond our imagination, or even lots of pieces are written by virtuosic players. And then, I also remember when I wrote for the bamboo flute, I had my friend stay in my apartment for 2 weeks. So I consulted with him every single day. Like, I'm writing these two measures. Can you try that for me? Okay, maybe it's not. Let me revise this part. And then can you do this? Oh, you can do this. Okay, you can do the throat tone. And what about click? How loud it is? So that you're exploring possibilities, with your friend, and what's it's always the good idea. I think it's just like in the old days when Mozart was writing the clarinet concerto, when Brahms was writing the clarinet quintet. They were writing for a good player. They're having them to try out for them as well. I think it's the same way that it never goes old. I think the second part question was
about sources. Yes,
good research about the chamber works. I think for some of the Tandun works, they're online, they are perusal scores. I'm not sure about the Guo Wenjing piece, whether it's perusal or whether there are definitely recordings online that you can listen to, but I'm not sure if there are perusal scores. But also the benefit is, those are all living composers. I'm sure there are ways that we can get reach to those composers and ask for a reference score that you want to study. Also those pieces that I mentioned, like by Chen Yi, by Guo Wenjing, or by Tandun, or by Ye Xiaogang. Those are all living composers, and it's unlike Bach, you can't even call him, but those are all living composers. I'm sure there will be a way for us to connect with those composers and they'll get those scores for study purpose. Definitely, yeah.
So wonderful. I want to thank you very much, Chen Qigang. And let me say now, as we conclude, this is the last of our 4 lectures, the end of part 1, stage 1 of the project. I thank our 4 students. The 4 lecturers have really been outstanding, I think. And the conception of the project is very interesting. And now we will go into the work phase and reconvene next April for the conference at Bard, and then look forward very much to the performances, both in the US and in Hong Kong. And so with that, I thank everyone and wish you all a very good night or day, depending on where you are. Bye-bye.